goodness, guys. That's it. This is what we've been waiting for. That is the mating call of a wild Daily Solutions if I've ever heard one. We're hot on its trail. We're not going to make too much noise here. I'd say it's about 100, 120 meters away right now. We're going to be sneaking up around the side here. It looks like it spotted us. This isn't good. Run! Go! Drop the camera, just get out of here. All right. Welcome, everybody.
Welcome.
This is Graham here.
This is Ashkan.
And today's question is 3 words, pods versus cabins. Question mark at the end.
Did it say 3 words in the question? Or was that you added that?
No, I added
editorial
that. Yeah,
sort
no,
of...
there's much more editorial side.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it added a nice kind of dramatic effect
Thanks.
to it.
Yeah, I've been trying to kind of play up these questions a little bit.
Good. Yeah, we should edit everybody's questions.
All right. So, pods versus I guess we can just turn this into pods versus cabins versus whatever the heck other type of open tank
different
or
styles.
different styles of float tank. Yeah. I assume.
Well, let's hold on.
Yeah.
Let's for a second. Let's maybe break down some of the vocabulary of the different words for float tanks or pods or all that sort of stuff. Which is partially that there is no strict vocabulary.
That's what I was going to say. When we tend to use float tanks here at Float Tank Solutions just as the generic term for float tanks.
Yeah.
So we use that interchangeably for everything.
But you hear, I mean, there's people call them float tanks, float pods, float cabins, float rooms, float chambers,
sensory deprivation tanks. Yeah.
So, sometimes people will say those words and they'll just mean whatever. They're just calling the general concept, whatever the word they prefer. And then when you actually kind of look at the different sizes and stuff like that, I usually call them I guess tanks and pods I usually put in the same category myself, just because I think people usually distinguish those between kind of their shape. But to me, it's like low ceiling, high ceiling, totally open room are like the 3 categories I kind of piece them into in my mind.
Yeah, for sure. And honestly, different manufacturers will even call their units different names. So there's not only is there not an industry name for it, like if you go out looking for all of the float cabins, for example, some of them might be called rooms, some still might just be called float tanks that are tall style float tanks. So
and then there's the wave that is a cabin on one end and a tank on the other end. So it's pretty hard to actually firmly categorize these things.
Yeah. So don't expect any kind of consistency in naming, I guess, when you're going out there looking. But like Ashkan said, I also think that there's this sort of smaller laydown inside it, like smaller self-contained style.
Like it's a style you wouldn't be able to fully stand up in.
Yeah, and then ones where you can stand up, and then ones that are just totally open and built in.
Yeah, built into the room itself. Like the walls of your float tank are
the walls of the room.
Yeah.
All right. So that said, I guess the question really is what one should I get? Or there's just a question mark at the end. So I assume it's what do you guys prefer or something like that?
And, it's people, this is a place where a lot of people have a lot of opinions. And I guess and it's a question we get a ton from people who are opening up.
Yeah.
And the nice thing is at our center, we have a variety and have had a variety. And so we've kind of gotten to experience any category you can imagine, like open rooms, cabins, pods, tanks. We've had a slew of different types in our center. And it's interesting. I would say at the end of the day, ultimately, I don't think it makes as much of a difference as people think. A lot of people think it's almost like a make or break decision for their business in terms of what style they're getting.
Right, and we've seen so many businesses out there that are, killing it with all old Samadhi tanks or Oasis tanks or something on the smaller side, and people who are out there who are, killing it with really big rooms that are 6 feet wide and you can stand up fully inside them, and liners, no liners. It seems to, and for those of you who have actually experienced floating in a bunch of different units, as well, the experience inside is more similar than it is different for all of these different float tanks, right. I guess is just our term for it.
It's dark. It's quiet, the actual amount of space inside that you're floating. I mean, some of them are bigger than others, but it ends up not being that crazy of a difference.
I would honestly say that having the variety of tanks for me is more important than what that variety is. I really enjoy having a couple different types of units that we can shuffle people between.
Yeah, I mean, and here's kind of been my experience with our center is I feel like if it's someone's first time, not always, but sometimes they'll tend to look at the bigger units and they just seem slightly less intimidating if you've never floated before. But that could also be because we have a variety and they can actually look at one room and see a smaller one and look in another room and see a bigger one and be like, oh, I want to be in that bigger one. So, you might not get that effect if people don't have anything to compare it to when they're coming into your shop. But I'll notice that, people will gravitate towards cabin style or open room style a little bit more. And not everybody. Some people will see the more pod-like ones and be like, oh, yeah, I'm getting in that thing.
Yeah, it is true. I think that our members end up floating more regularly in our smaller tanks.
So that's just the first time.
Yeah,
that's just the first time. And then once people float that first time, after that, I find it to be all over the place. Like, people just tend to gravitate towards the different styles for their own reasons. I'd say a lot of people just don't care after that. They float and they realize that, the shape and size and what it looks like is not of the most importance. And when they book with us in the future, they won't really care what float tank they end up in. Or other ones they just really like that more cocoon-like feeling in the pod versions, or they like being able to stand up as they get in and out. Or, sometimes they find some other feature of that specific float tank or that model that, maybe like it just holds temperature in a certain way that's a little bit better, and they prefer it for that reason rather than the size or the shape or any of that other stuff.
Yeah, and there really are people who just end up having their favorite tanks.
Right.
And, lots of times it has nothing to do with the tank itself. It's more the experience they had inside there. It was like the first float where they really broke through or kind of, had crazy visuals, and now that's their tank for sure. Every time they come back in, room 3,
We
or
even
room 4.
Yeah, I mean, we even at the point where rooms 3 and 4 were exactly the same. I remember a customer who only booked in room 3, and I was like, "Oh, we have room 4 open?
You want its twin next door?"
Yeah, they're like,
no. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, once again, if you expected concrete answers on something like this from us, you're looking in the wrong place. But I do think that, once again, having a variety of units as opposed to a singular one is really nice. You can do cool things too. Like, if someone has a bad experience in a big open pool, you can kind of say like, oh, well, maybe you'd like something that's a little more womb-like or something a little more contained,
Yeah.
And kind of shift them over, and vice versa if they had a bad experience in the other one.
If we're talking about variety, maybe it's a slightly different topic, but we should at least point out the downsides of variety too, which is that from operations, it can make your life more difficult. It's basically like that many more tanks that you need to have an understanding of. You need to know how the controls work. You need to know how the filtration systems work. You need to have a bunch of extra spare parts for all the different versions of everything that could go wrong and all that sort of stuff. So it adds complexity to your business. But I would say we get compliments on it as a center. Like, people seem to like coming in and seeing that there's like a number of tanks to choose between.
Yeah, basically it's cooler for the customer, and I think gives them a reason to come back in if they might not otherwise. If they had like a bad experience in one style, there's kind of this incentive to come try another style. But it sucks on the back end. So it's just a decision to make your life harder so that your customers are a little happier.
And yeah, I guess really at the end of the day, I would say I don't think the difference in aesthetics or size of the float tanks matter as much as people think they do. I think you can run a successful business with any of them. I think the differences are how many customers you're going to gain or lose or whatever based off of that idea of kind of the shape and size of your float tank is not quite as pronounced or significant as people think it is before they go to open their centers.
Yep, I would agree with that. So there you have it. A little more than 3 words for your answer, but... And if you have any of your own questions and want to send them in, go to floatanksolutions.com/podcast.
And we'll answer them.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.